welcome to Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which features interviews and discussions on all issues relating to high quality in the early years and school-age care sector. In our episodes, we have a range of speakers who are leaders in the areas that matter to Early Childhood Ireland members. This podcast series is proudly supported by Arachis Insurance, which offers a comprehensive range of cover at discounted premiums for both business and personal insurance products. So visit www.arachis.ie for more information. In Early Childhood Ireland, we've dedicated November this year to child safeguarding. Throughout the month, we've been sharing essential information to help members to enhance the safeguarding practices across our sector. So for this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Laura Dagger, who's the coordinator at the National Child Safeguarding Office. Laura has worked in many roles in the early years sector as an educator, as a mentor, and as a leader. She brings an MA in leadership and advocacy in the early years from the Atlantic Technological University, and she has a postgraduate diploma in child protection and welfare from Trinity College in her role as well, and that's combined with over 20 years experience. So many of you will know already that the National Child Safeguarding Office develops Children First training, resources and information to support child-centred practice that keeps children safe from harm while attending early years and school-age care settings in Ireland. So, Laura, you're really welcome back to the podcast. This is your second episode with us, so it's lovely to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me, Moira. It's great to be here, and it's great to get these messages out to the early years and school age services that are members of Early Childhood Ireland.
And it is about getting those messages, and I suppose enhancing the provision that's already there and reminding people maybe of areas that they could maybe look a little bit at again. So I suppose to start with, could you take us through the legal obligations that early years and school age care settings have under the Children First Act? And I know there have been some amendments to that lately. So you can take us through the legal obligations and maybe the implications that these amendments have had for registered providers.
Yeah, okay, we'll certainly start there, Moira. And I suppose just as I'm going through the legal obligations, just that I suppose just to remember that it's more than just a legal obligation that the services have in relation to safeguarding. And we do want to ensure that everybody understands that safeguarding children is everybody's responsibility in services nationally. So under the Children First Act, I suppose the main things or the main legal responsibilities that services and people working in the services have is around that being the provider of a relevant service. So early years services, so preschool services, school age childcare services, and TUSLA registered childminding services are relevant services under the Children First Act, and so they are obliged to have a child safeguarding statement in place, and they are also obliged to have a number of child safeguarding policies and procedures in place that work alongside all of their other child safeguarding or child protection and welfare policies and procedures in their organisation. Second to that, then, there are certain people who work in early years and school age care services who fall into the category of mandated persons. And there, as you said there have been some changes recently in relation to who mandated persons are in early years services. So effectively, the quickest way to find out if you're a mandated person is to consult Schedule 2 of the Children First Act. And Schedule 2 of the Children First Act was recently amended by the Childcare Amendment Act there just at the end of September this year. So yeah, the Childcare Amendment Act 2024 has amended both the Childcare Act and the Children First Act. And the result is the definition of an early years service in the Childcare Act has changed to include that preschool service, school-aged service and childminder, as I said, that's registered with TUSLA. Further to that, the Childcare Amendment Act has also amended Schedule 2 of the Children First Act to refer to a broader term of early years. So previously, Schedule 2 would have said preschool. Those working as childcare workers in preschool services were mandated persons. So obviously that excluded practitioners or educators who are working in school-age childcare services. So with the amendment from the Childcare Amendment Act, Schedule 2 now refers to early years. So it's a childcare worker employed in early years services in Ireland are mandated persons. Further to that, Schedule 2 also identifies persons carrying on an early years service. So that's the registered provider with TUSLA is also a mandated person under the Children First Act. So I suppose if we were to think about the legal obligations that mandated persons have, so mandated persons have a legal obligation to report harm to children above a defined threshold of harm, and that's the defined threshold of harm as per the Children First Act.
And
so
what kind of, can you take us through maybe some of what that defined threshold means, Laura?
Yeah, so under the Children First National Guidance, there's reasonable grounds for concern. So reasonable grounds for concern is what everybody reports under. When it comes to mandated persons, they have an additional responsibility to identify if the threshold of harm has been met when they're considering a child protection or welfare concern. So basically, the threshold of harm, which is outlined in the Children First Act, applies to mandated persons. And as I said, they're those people who are listed in Schedule 2 of the Act. The definition of harm or harm is defined in the Children First Act as assault, ill treatment, or neglect of a child in a manner that seriously affects or is likely to seriously affect the child's health, development, or welfare, or any concerns relating to sexual abuse of a child. That would be the definition of harm. The threshold for that definition of harm is met when a mandated person has a belief that harm has occurred to the point that it will seriously or is likely to seriously affect the child's health, development, or welfare.
Okay, that's very clear. So sorry, I think I cut across you there when you were saying about the mandated persons, but just, sometimes it's good to hear the definition of the threshold when you mention it. So you were talking about the legal responsibilities of the mandated person there.
Yeah,
and who
so
the mandated
and I suppose
are.
the other legal obligation that a mandated person has is it's the term that you would have heard of is mandated assisting. So a mandated person is legally obliged to assist TUSLA if requested in their assessment of a mandated report. So basically that means that if a mandated person makes a mandated report, TUSLA can contact them looking for further information in relation to the child, in relation to the concern, in relation to anything that will effectively assist TUSLA in their assessment of the report that they've received.
And the mandated person isn't always a DLP or a DDLP, am I right?
Yeah, so a mandated person, as I said earlier, mandated person are only those people who are specified in Schedule 2. I suppose the difference is with a DLP. A DLP is appointed by an early years service, and the DLP may or may not be a mandated person. So the DLP or the DDLP is the designated or deputy designated liaison person, and the DLP plays a key role in ensuring that services, report and procedures are used effectively and are implemented where there's a concern about a child. So no, there wouldn't necessarily be a link between a mandated person and a deputy or a designated liaison person. Often in early years and school age care, the DLP is a mandated person because it's usually the manager, it's usually a supervisor, it's usually somebody in a position of authority in the early years service that would hold that DLP role. But it is an appointed role as opposed to a legal role under the Children First Act.
A mandated role. Okay.
Yeah.
So is there more that you need to cover about mandated persons, or can we move?
We can move on. What I would just say is that anybody who is a mandated person, their employer should be letting them know that they're a mandated person. We would expect that everybody in early years and school age services complete the TUSLA Universal e-learning programme to understand their responsibility in relation to child safeguarding. But there is also a mandated person e-learning programme that will outline all of the responsibilities of mandated persons for anyone who wants to do it. But employers should be very aware of the fact that if there are mandated persons working in their service, they should let them know that they're mandated, and they should help them to understand that role as a mandated person, and the e-learning programme really is the best way to go about that. TUSLA's e-learning programme.
And that's on the TUSLA website.
TUSLA website. It can be found under the National Child Safeguarding Programme website. A simple Google of mandated person will bring you directly to that e-learning programme. Yeah.
We can put the links to those in the podcast notes as
Great.
well.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit then about the safeguarding statement and what's involved in that and what's legally required to go into that?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, early years services registered with TUSLA registered early years services are relevant services under the Children First Act, and there's many obligations, I suppose, as being a relevant service, and one of them is that you must have a child safeguarding statement in place in your organisation. So a child safeguarding statement it's a statement from your service that outlines how you intend to keep children safe from harm while they're using your service. One of the key elements of a child safeguarding statement is that risk assessment that's contained within it. And it's a risk assessment, it's specific to harm, and its harm is defined in the Children First Act that we discussed earlier on there. So further to that, what the Children First Act would say is that relevant services must have specific policies and procedures in place to ensure that children are kept safe from harm. So so I was saying there that there are 6 specified procedures under the Children First Act that relevant services must have in place in their organisation. And there's also then a 7th procedure, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment as well. So the 6 that I'm talking about there are, the first is that every relevant service must have a list of mandated person, must have and maintain a list of mandated persons. So anyone who is a mandated person in the service must be on this list, and there must be a procedure in place to make sure that they understand their role. So as I was saying, they can complete the TUSLA Universal e-learning programme or the TUSLA mandated person e-learning programme, which will support them to understand their role. There must also be a procedure in place just around appointing a relevant person. So the relevant person in an organisation is the person who's appointed by the provider of the relevant service to be the first point of contact in respect of the provider's child safeguarding statement. So look, as with everything in early years services, it's usually the same person that holds that role within the organisation. But just to bear in mind that the appointment of a relevant person is specified under the Children First Act. Further to that, then the additional specified procedures are there must be a procedure in place to manage any allegations that are made against workers or volunteers in the organisation. There must be a procedure in place for selection and recruitment of appropriate people to work with children in your service. There must be a reporting procedure for child protection and welfare concerns to TUSLA Social Work Department. And there must also then be a procedure in place around information and training that's specific to child safeguarding for everybody within the organisation. So they're the 6 specified procedures. The 7th specified procedure that I'm talking about is a bit more general in that there must also be additional procedures in place to mitigate any risks that are identified in that risk assessment in your child safeguarding statement. That list is endless around the types of policies and procedures that you might have in place, and they'll be very, very specific to each early years service. But I suppose generally what we would be expecting to see in early years services would be that there's a code of behaviour in place which would outline, expectations of staff or expectations of workers, volunteers, students, anybody who's in the service and working with the children. We'd expect to see a procedure around confidentiality, how information is shared in relation to child safeguarding concerns, and record keeping, again, specific to child safeguarding concerns. We'd like to see complaints and disciplinary procedures in place that if there are allegations made against staff members or workers or volunteers, anybody in the organisation, that people understand that there's a procedure in place there to support them and also then for the service to meet their obligations under the Children First Act and guidance. We'd expect to see procedures in place around how services work in partnership with children and families when there's child safeguarding concerns. Communicating concerns with parents before reports are made where it's possible, sharing child safeguarding procedures with parents as soon as the children start in the organisation, so that parents know that the organisation is looking at how best to involve parents when there's a concern about the child. And then there's some procedures we'd like to see in place that would also cross over with regulatory requirements of the likes of support and supervision for workers and volunteers within the organisation as well.
That's quite a list, and I suppose settings have a lot of them in place over the years, but familiarity, it's part of recruitment. I suppose that it's part of, making sure that people know what's there, that they're not documents that were written 3 or 4 years ago and aren't updated. That
Absolutely. And
people
I
know
suppose
what's there, and like you say, induction.
induction, yeah, like and your specified procedures, so those 6 specified procedures that I referred to earlier on, they under the Children First Act should be reviewed every 24 months. So every 2 years there should be a review of the specified procedures. We'd go so far as to say there really should be a review of your policies and procedures every 2 years or sooner if you're using those policies and procedures. So if you've had a concern and for example, it's relating to a code of behavior issue within the organization, when you've implemented that procedure and when you've enacted that procedure, it's always a good time afterwards to sit down and think how it worked. Does it need to be reviewed? Did it work right? Did it support everybody it needed to support? And just ensuring that the procedures, that, as you're saying, that they're there and that they're useful. There's no point in having them on a shelf and nobody knowing what they are or understanding what they are. So yeah, that's absolutely what we'd recommend there. Yeah.
If or when it arises that there is a concern, that's where policies and procedures really come into their own, is that when you're in the throes of, trying to decide what to do in what can be an awfully difficult situation, that you have something clear and unambiguous, and that's legal, that that you're doing the right thing. It's so important.
It's hugely important, because whether a concern comes to you, whether something is observed in a service, whether a parent, whether a worker brings a concern to a DLP in an organisation, the first port of call for the DLP is to review the report and procedure to see what steps need to be taken next. And if those steps are outlined clearly, it takes a lot of the stress out of the situation. Because again, as you're saying there, it's clear, it's unambiguous, you know exactly what you need to do, what steps you need to take, and it alleviates some of the stress, because it's going to be a stressful situation regardless of how it plays out,
Yeah, and for educators and staff, that they know who to go to, that they don't tease it out with other people before they decide to go to the designated liaison person, which can be your go-to can be, this is my gut instinct, am I doing the right thing? But confidentiality is paramount.
It's absolutely paramount, and we would always say that confidentiality, when you're thinking about safeguarding concerns, you're talking about a need to know basis. So who needs to know about this concern that I have? And quite often with educators, it's a gut, it's a feeling. It's not necessarily something a child has very clearly said. It might be something a child has indicated, or something you've observed in a child's play that's making you think, God, I have a concern here. But absolutely that idea of where do I go and what do I do with that information or with that concern, your DLP is always your first port of call. It's the DLP who needs to know. Your colleague in the room doesn't need to know that you have a concern. Your colleague in the lunch room when you're having a cup of tea or whatever it is, it's not appropriate to discuss them concerns there. The DLP is the person in the organisation. They're the resource. They're the ones that have the additional training, knowledge, information around safeguarding. And they're the ones that are hugely familiar with the report and procedure, so they'll know exactly what to do. Confidentiality is key, and sharing information about concerns is absolutely on a need to know basis.
And I suppose the DLP will know when the action is keep an eye out, see if there are other little niggles that can arise, or when you go to TUSLA for advice.
Exactly. So the DLP, if somebody comes to the DLP and they have a concern, the first thing to think about is reasonable grounds for concern. So they're the reasonable grounds for concern that are outlined in the Children First National Guidance, and they're hugely important in terms of establishing whether or not your concern is something that needs to be brought to TUSLA. So what we would be saying that is, if a worker has a concern, they bring it to the DLP, they review reasonable grounds for concern. If they can't establish whether or not reasonable grounds for concern exist, the next step is to call TUSLA for informal consultation. TUSLA are always open to having a conversation with you to help you identify whether or not you need to take any further steps in terms of your concern. So reasonable grounds for concern with the DLP and the person with the concern is absolutely the first step there to establish if it exists.
Great. And I was going to ask you about parents, and you've already touched on that it's so important to make parents aware of the procedures that you have in place, not just when there are concerns, that parents need to know this is a safe place for their children to be, and that you're all on the one page about ensuring children's safety.
And look, I know induction of parents is hugely important at the beginning of any term in an earlier service where children are starting. And services are great for sharing policies and procedures with parents, but I suppose we all know that maybe they're not read or they're not given the attention that they need. And it is only when a concern arises that parents might say, well, why are you talking to TUSLA? And I don't understand why you're making this report. And it's then that you can fall back on your procedure and say, well, look, we did share this with you at the beginning of the year. But what we would be saying is that where it's appropriate and when there's a concern about a child, the first point of call for the DLP when a concern is brought to their attention is to establish if the parent is somebody that needs to hear about this concern, because quite often concerns can grow, they can build. It's sometimes it's an accumulation of information that makes a report needed to TUSLA. Obviously there are one-off concerns that you would report to TUSLA, but often it's where you're wondering what's going on here. Often concerns can be nipped in the bud quite early by having open and honest communication with parents. So having a meeting and say, look, we're observing that, I don't know, the child is coming in hungry, or the child has an untreated nappy rash. We need to wonder why you're not treating the nappy rash. Is there anything we can do to help you? So playing that supportive role for parents is hugely important. In safeguarding, and having those open, honest lines of communications with parents, and sharing policies and procedures in theory is a great way to do it, but often we know they're not read, the procedures aren't read. So conversations as early as possible with parents are key in protecting children when there's a concern.
So I suppose moving out then at this point, Laura, we've talked about, the legal requirements, what mandated persons, who they are, what they need to do, and you've taken us through the 7 requirements. And we've talked about mandated persons, we've talked about DLPs and so on, but it's much broader than that, isn't it? Safeguarding is everybody's concern. Can you talk to us a bit about, who's responsible, why? I'm reminded of the one of the TUSLA e-learning programs where it's the caretaker that shares a concern.
Absolutely, and it's a universal issue. If you are, whether you're in work, at home, socializing, child protection and welfare, child safeguarding is absolutely should be at the forefront of everybody's mind at all times. I suppose when we're talking about the topic of safeguarding or keeping children safe from harm, we use the terminology of child protection and welfare and the terminology of child safeguarding kind of interchangeably, and I suppose sometimes that the child protection and welfare terminology can be a little bit narrow because it's assuming that there's a child at risk. It's assuming that a child's welfare needs aren't being met. But actually what safeguarding is a much broader concept. It's around safe practice. It's about understanding what appropriate responses are to concerns. And as we just discussed there, an appropriate appropriate response to a concern might be just having a conversation with your DLP. It might be contacting TUSLA directly. There may be different responses, but understanding where to go to know what your next response is. Safeguarding, it's really about protecting children from harm. It's about promoting their welfare, and it's about creating that environment that supports children to grow, develop, and achieve their full potential. So it's kind of so linked into everything that's been done in an early years service on a daily basis. We're all working towards children achieving their full potential. We're all working towards children extending their knowledge, understanding, what their rights are, having their voice being heard, all of those kind of things. So safeguarding it's in everything everything that we do, whether we're in work, whether we're at home, wherever it is. But there is a responsibility for adults in society to protect children, and that's absolutely what the Children First National Guidance would outline.
And I think one of the things I like about the broadening from protection to safeguarding is that, I think maybe there was a time when we were focused on physical abuse, sexual abuse, and we forgot maybe sometimes about emotional abuse and neglect, and that it takes into account all the different types of abuse, and that our responsibility is to, keep children safe, and that includes nurturing, loving, caring relationships. It's not just physical.
Exactly, and I suppose that's why the early years sector as such is so unique in terms of the relationships that educators have with children, and that are forged with children over a period of time. There are some children that might start in an early years service at 6 months old and not leave until they're starting secondary school. Do you know, if it's a service that offers that full range of supports to children and families. So understanding that you're a very safe person in a lot of these situations for those children, that if something is going wrong for them, or if something doesn't sit right with them, if they have a concern, them understanding that you're their safe person there, and I suppose you acting in a way through your work that shows children you hear them, you listen to them, you respect them, you understand their concerns, really supports children when things go wrong, or when children do need a little bit of extra support, or have a concern that they're not comfortable to bring up at home. Educators in early years and school age care are pivotal in terms of offering that support, and it really is unique across all of the sectors in society around how we support children to do that, and the relationships that we have with children in our care and that we work with on a daily basis.
And that bit about listening in all the ways the children can, we often talk about Reggio Emilia and the 100 languages, and that, the 6-month-old, if we're tuned in, can let us know that there's something amiss as much as the 6-year-old can. It's just they express it in different ways. And that's why, that being tuned in, emotionally connecting to children is really important, because it helps us to see, like you mentioned, the expression of there being something wrong can come across through their play or their nonverbal cues as much as saying this happened, or I don't like this, or I don't like when people do X, Y, or Z.
Exactly. And again, to go back to a term that you used earlier on, it's that gut, that feeling when you're working with a child, be it 3 hours a day, 8 hours a day, you're so tuned into their cues. You're so tuned into what they're telling you, as you're saying, whether it's verbal or non-verbal, but what they're communicating. The rights of the child and understanding how children communicate is absolutely key. And safeguarding, using the word or the terminology of safeguarding really encapsulates all of that, for sure it does. Yeah.
So I think we've covered, the legal aspects and the fact that it's everybody's responsibility. It isn't just educators, it isn't just managers. It's, everybody can be managers, cooks, cleaners, admin staff. In a broader family centre, it could be other staff of the centre who may, observe something as children are gathering at the start of the day or whatever it is. But if people are wondering kind of where to go for further information or advice on training, you mentioned about the various e-learning programs and so on, and we'll link to those. Are there more sources of information and support and advice to support
definitely
CPD?
Yeah, so the National Child Safeguarding Programme, we would work very closely with TUSLA's Children First Information and Advice Service, and we would produce an awful lot of resources that are supported by the Children First Information and Advice Service to help services to understand their role in safeguarding. I absolutely understand the stresses on services at the moment. Getting out to training is a difficulty. Staff shortages, finding time to attend training is such a big issue. And that's why we would really promote the e-learning programs. Everybody in every early years service or every early years and school age care service in the country should complete TUSLA's e-learning program. Everybody who's a mandated person should complete that mandated person e-learning program. But there is also face-to-face training that's available through the City and County Childcare Committees nationally. That can be attended by anybody in the service. We would fully recommend that every DLP and deputy DLP attend training with their local CCC. So it's a 6-hour face-to-face programme. The CCCs are quite flexible in how they run them. They might run them on a Saturday. They might run the programme in 2-3-hour sessions over 2 evenings. If you contact your CCC, they are absolutely willing to run these programs in any way that makes them accessible to early years services. Further to that, we've also in the National Child Safeguarding Programme, we this year have just started rolling out DLP training. So what this is it's a 2-part blended learning programme for people in the DLP or deputy DLP role, or people who are planning to move into that role soon. And what that is it's an e-learning programme as part A. It's universally accessible, so people in the DLP role or deputy DLP role can absolutely go online and do part A of the training, that online piece for the DLP training. But we also then offer a face-to-face 3.5-hour session for DLPs, which, as I say, it's brand new this year. We're hoping to roll it out fully nationally next year. But what the DLP training allows is it allows DLPs to come together in a safe space. We have a number of scenarios that we bring the DLPs through and to discuss that role, to discuss what the limitations of the role are, to discuss the challenges, but also to come up with the solutions that will support the DLPs to meet the needs of their services. So we have an awful lot of resources on our website as well. We've a number of what we call infoblasts, which are short 1 or 2 page documents on different topics relating to safeguarding. So we'd have them around the mandated persons, we'd have them around training. So I mentioned that a training strategy is one of the specified procedures under the Children First Act that relevant services must have in place. So the training strategy, it can be as simple or as complex as a service can implement or can allow for. It can be as simple as everybody completing the e-learning programs. You can have it where you take it a step further and say that all your staff over a 5-year period might attend the foundation training. Or you might also start to incorporate some of those infoblasts into staff training that you're doing yourself in your organisation, staff meetings. Even just we have a number of posters around thresholds of harm, around thresholds of reporting, so reasonable grounds for concern and the threshold of harm. We'd have posters around roles and responsibilities. Simply printing them off and making them available to people in the organisation is as good as can be done in a lot of services. So to have those resources there can be really helpful around that training strategy and understanding how training can be provided.
Great. That's a lot of support and resources there. I like the idea of incorporating them into staff meetings because that means, going back to what we were saying at the start, that sometimes policies and procedures are developed and they just, especially if they're not ones that you need to use on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah,
they can
sit on the shelf and never be looked at. Yeah.
Whereas, having a little slot in every staff meeting where you look at safeguarding can, keep
one topic at a time. And, if the DLP or if anybody in the service attends the foundation training, bringing back the information that's there as well. And that has been, been given in the training can be so helpful. And there's a lot of resources that are emailed out after the foundation training, like different e-learning programs, webinars, videos. TUSLA have a huge range of very short animations on their YouTube channel around understanding your safeguarding statement, understanding the role of mandated persons, identifying child protection and welfare concerns. Really short 4 or 5 minute animations that, again, if you were to show one of them at a staff meeting and go through one of the infoblasts, you're given as much information as you can in that short period of time. And it's not putting more pressure on you as a service to get people out to training and that kind of thing.
And it's keeping it in mind, which is the important thing.
Yeah.
So anything else, Laura, that you'd like to mention before we wrap
No,
up?
I think I've covered everything there. Just what I would just say is that anyone listening to this podcast who's starting to think about their safeguarding in their organisation, make sure your reporting procedure is your first port of call. You know, go back and have a look at the reporting procedure, because as we said, is if there is a concern or if there's something that comes to your service or to your organisation around a concern relating to a child, the reporting procedure is usually that first port of call. So making sure the DLP understands what the reporting procedure is, and that everybody in your service knows who the DLP is, how they can be contacted, and what steps they need to take when there is a concern about a child.
Perfect. Laura, that's great. Thank you so much. There's, I think we've hit a lot of information there, and lots of signposting to the various resources. So, Laura, thanks a million.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Early Childhood Ireland's podcast, which is proudly supported by Aricus Insurance. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, spread the word to your friends and colleagues, and stay tuned for our next episode.